at the heart of my police and crime plan is that focus on policing with the community, and indeed, as we've been alluding to, some of our more rural communities are quite spread out across the very large force area that we serve. So we're just going to hear from some of the comments and issues raised by the public.
And like I say, we've got no backup. You ring 999. You know, okay, PC Roberts, our rural officer, is very good, but obviously he's never on duty when you need him. You know, we just feel as though we've got no help, no support, and, you know, there's just nobody there that you literally can ring and say, help.
The PCSOs, although there may be more numbers, is there still a plan to stop them at 8 p.m. at night? Because this is very difficult for many communities, and they are particularly needed in areas of high antisocial behaviour. And one of the areas of Meal is such an area. It's the fifth highest area of socio-economic and multiple indices of deprivation in Shropshire, and has seen a rapid increase in crime. It will be a retrograde step significantly if PCSOs do not patrol or are not on duty after 8 p.m. at night.
So the wildlife crime officers, again, you've mentioned there's 5, I think. I understand it's the whole of West Mercia. Again, I'd like to name check PC Not. He's been out and done work in the past. If he's not in the area, these people aren't often on your property for that long. It's quite hard to get hold of people, and whether there will be any more police wildlife officers in the future.
One simple question: where is the PCSO? We never ever see any visible sign of a police presence. There just aren't any patrol cars at any time of the day. The thing is, we just don't see any police presence at all.
Covered by the PC and the PCSO is enormous. The one PC works a shift work. He isn't around very often in the evenings because he works all the other shifts as well. So there's no allocated police in the area except those on call in emergency. From where they are, I do not know. But everybody I have spoken to, and a number have contacted me, as being very upset at the loss of police presence and availability in the evenings.
I do agree with Vivian and Roger that, as far as I'm concerned, in the town I live just outside Oxford Street, police don't exist. The only time you ever see a police officer, then you don't see him because he's in his speed camera. But the thing is, it's a case of, I just think what's lacking in West Mercia is communication. And as I say, I just think if you may have 4,500 police people here, but in Pant, where I am, is that you never see anybody. And the thing is, if you used to report something, I'm sure nothing's going to get done about it.
So I think forever, the challenge of visibility and accessibility of policing is always going to remain. I'm here at Force Headquarters today. There could be 20 police officers outside my home, and I wouldn't know because I'm here, and there'll be no trace of them after they've left. They're unlikely to be a trace. You've just heard a number of people in the video clip talk about that perception of how visible and accessible your officers and staff are in our community. How do you give yourself some reassurance that not all of what has been said is the case, and it is that job of maybe articulating better rather than fixing the underlying problem of your teams not being visible?
Yeah, I take seriously the messages that have been put across there. At the most basic level, I'd like to reassure people that we are always there. So there was a comment in respect of, I'm not sure that anyone's going to be there when we need them. If the public need us, then we were always there. As I said, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And you look strategically at the response times, don't you? Especially in an emergency, you look regularly at the time it takes for your officers to get to incident.
Yeah, so we will examine on a weekly basis the success of our ability to respond to emergencies, and Rachel, as the senior officer responsible for examining the force's performance, will look in a very great level of detail every month across the force, rural and urban areas, as to our success in getting to places when we are needed. And then what I'd say on top of that, you're absolutely right, John, in terms of where we have been, when people are out and about during the day, they are more likely to see us, but won't necessarily know why we're in a particular area. Some of our rural communities may not see us during the night, but we will undertake patrols there. One of the great beauties of West Mercia and working here is the nature of the geography, the nature of the 3 counties that we police, but it is a vast area. It's entirely right, and I think people would expect me to deploy resource where it's likely to have the most benefit. So we do so by virtue of analysing crime data, by identifying crime hotspots, by targeting offenders, to try and ensure that we have the greatest chance of being in the right place at the right time to either prevent the crime from happening, as some of our hotspot activity has proven, or of catching an offender. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean catching an offender in the act of committing a crime. Most rural crimes are committed via the road network. And so we will deploy officers based on intelligence, based on having the maximum opportunity of identifying someone either going to or from having committed an offence. And then there are certain types of data that we can draw on to assure ourselves. So our hotspot policing, as I've alluded to, we are able to pinpoint geographically using GPS the amount of time that officers have spent in a hotspot or in our hotspots across the force. Those are identified as high levels of crime area, and we track that to ensure that it's being done properly. And then our vehicle capability includes telematics. So we are able to review the amount of time spent by our staff in vehicles as they patrol the county. And that's particularly useful during hours of darkness when people may not otherwise see us. We are there for a purpose, and that purpose is either to prevent a crime happening or to try and solve a crime that is in progress. So I understand, given the enormous geography of the area, given that people have their own lives in terms of going to different places, why they may not always see us, or they may not always know why we are somewhere. But I want to get the message across to the people who work for the force and the public that whenever we do something, we should know why we're doing it, and we should go somewhere with a purpose. That purpose may include going to a location, an area where someone may not have seen us for some time, and we want to try and increase the confidence of those local communities. So this isn't all about a hard-nosed approach to enforcement. I would expect people to understand where haven't we patrolled recently, particularly neighbourhood teams, say, right, we are going to go there, and we're going to go at a time of maximum footfall so that people can see me, they can articulate that they've seen me. But everything we should do should have a purpose, and we should try and get that message across.
So you talked around the using data and evidence to direct activity, but also it helps inform your allocation of your resources. And I know that you have made interventions around allocating additional resources into the rural areas, and indeed there are some more plans that will come to life this financial year. Do you just want to explain a little bit more around the thinking of those two different sets of decisions?
Yes, so during the last financial year, we undertook some analysis regarding the levels of resourcing amongst our response officers, informed by our ability to get to places quickly when we needed to. And we moved a number of officers from across the force to support Shropshire, huge geography, huge area to be policed. And so now we are seeing some benefit in terms of more officers being able to respond quickly. And I say that with the acknowledgement that we would always want to get to places quicker, and members of the public would always appreciate us getting places quicker. The other thing that we are considering and implementing this year, linked to some of the operating model changes that I've discussed, is increasing the number of supervisory officers in certain parts of the force, so that there's a greater level of supervision both of patrol officers and of neighbourhood officers, based on the levels of coverage and the ratios between sergeants and constables. And then the third element, which I may touch on further shortly, is around new officers going into neighbourhood roles, and we are, during the course of 2025, 2026, adding further officers to neighbourhood policing teams aimed at supporting that ongoing problem solving work affecting all of our areas, and that will include a particular focus on rural areas, because during the course of the previous 12 months we created town centre teams. We're going to augment them and trying to add to them in certain areas, but having done that work last year, a key part of our focus for this year is to increase the number of neighbourhood officers supporting the rural community.
You heard it touched on the video a couple of times around there's some potential changes around PCSOs and how they may work. Do you want to explain a little bit about what is happening potentially with the PCSO hours, and why, on balance, you think it's the right thing for West Mercia's communities?
Yeah, so we are consulting on a proposed change at the moment. It's important that I say that we're consulting on a change to PCSO finishing hours from 10 o'clock in the evening to 8 o'clock in the evening. This is not a reduction in the hours performed by PCSOs. So people's PCSOs who work in their local communities will be working for just as many hours, finishing at 8 o'clock in the evening rather than 10 if agreed. Those neighbourhood policing officers who I've talked about will still continue to provide coverage later into the evening, and the response officers who provide that 24/7 coverage, their coverage remains unchanged. I think it's important that I say again, we talked about data, that we undertook some work to examine when the peak of antisocial behaviour as the core raison d'etre of our PCSOs is reported, and it peaks between 5 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon and starts to decrease thereafter, with a particularly marked decrease after 8 p.m. Now, there are of course instances when it's helpful to have access to a PCSO after 8 p.m, and I'm sure many of the people watching this may be able to think of those occasions. But this allows us to provide the greatest concentration of resource at the times when it is of greatest benefit to the public. And much of the work that our PCSOs, who do a superb job, undertake, yes, some of it is responding to something when it's happening, but that's really the job of officers, particularly when it comes to crime. And the workload after 8 p.m, particularly during the hours of darkness, tends to be more crime related. And that's when I would expect our officers to be able to provide the primary response. Much of the work of our PCSOs is about being highly visible, about building relationships with local communities and representatives thereof. And the greatest opportunity to do that is when people are out and about, or during the working day. So that's the logic behind it. There is also a necessity for us to consider it. Because as a newly appointed chief, this wouldn't have been the first thing that I would have chosen to consider. But in straightforward terms, the amount of funding available to the organisation, notwithstanding your support as commissioner, hasn't kept pace with the cost of the organisation related to inflation. So it has been necessary and unavoidable for us to consider cost reductions. We have done that in respect of costs that don't affect the service to the public or affect the service to the public less directly, by looking at certain posts within the organisation and also the way we do things. But this has been a necessity for us to consider, because it doesn't reduce the number of hours that PCSO work, but provides a saving by virtue of our PCSOs no longer receiving the same levels of unsocial hours payment. So I hope I've given an explanation for people in terms of why we considered this particular path The reality, however, is that we have to consider many other parts as well to ensure that the organisation is sustainable financially going forwards, and we're able to provide a really excellent service to people. And I say this with regret, but I don't say it thinking that this is not the right thing for us to consider in that context.
Is it fair to say that if the force hadn't taken this reduction in terms of when the PCSOs were working, that the actual number of PCSOs that we have in total would likely have had to reduce to balance out the saving that it generated?
If we hadn't considered this alternative, then I would have been coming to you definitely considering whether the number of PCSOs that we retain was sustainable. At the very least, it would have been other very important roles in the organisation that I would be saying we had to reduce because of the cost. So that might have been forensic staff, it might have been analytical staff, it might have been people in our contact centre. I don't know, because I felt that this was the appropriate course of action. But I considered various other areas to save this amount of money, and it would have meant people losing their jobs and not providing a service to the public as a result. This is a way of achieving a certain level of saving without reducing the number of PCSOs at all, and without reducing the number of hours that those PCSOs provide a service to their communities.
Thank you, Richard. You touched on earlier around some additional police resources, police officer resources coming into some of these teams, and indeed then the data that you were alluding to, the harm that actually presents itself to our community. Can you just unpack a little bit more around what that's likely to mean and what you envisage the benefits to the community be?
Yes, so during the course of this year, and we're currently identifying the first cohort, we will be putting in place some additional neighbourhood policing officers. So about 30 more neighbourhood policing, safer neighbourhood officers who are there to provide that ongoing problem-solving response to local communities. And that's being enabled through some additional grant funding that we've got access to. The significance of that, given the conversation we've just had around PCSOs, is the size of the neighbourhood response is getting bigger overall rather than smaller. And again, coming back to the issue of data and whether these are intelligent decisions, my explanation would be that going into the hours of darkness and into the evening, our demand shifts from confidence building, liaison with local communities, dealing with antisocial behaviour, and more towards the police and those committing crime making up a greater proportion of those who are out and about. So there is a greater chance of someone who we stop on the road or come into contact with during the evening being involved in something they potentially shouldn't be, because there are fewer people on the roads. It's easier for us to identify those who we might want to stop. And the powers that officers hold, as opposed to our PCSOs, of stopping vehicles, conducting searches, obviously the power to arrest people, means that I think there is greater benefit from officers performing that neighbourhood policing function into the evening up to midnight, and then their response colleagues thereafter, than PCSOs whose primary means of dealing crime is liaising with people up until that point at around 8 o'clock, when the antisocial behaviour levels tend to drop off.